For decades, she moved through the homes of expectant mothers, a name whispered in waiting rooms, church pews, and beauty salons across Houston's Third Ward. Sharon Denise Coleman, a woman of wisdom, experience, and grace. In a community where trust is earned through generations, she was a pillar, a healer, the steady hands that brought life into the world. Her clients believed they were in safe hands. They relied on her knowledge, her gentle reassurance, her years of experience guiding new mothers through the most vulnerable moments of their lives. They let her into their homes, their fears, their futures. From the outside, she was everything a midwife should be. Warm. Attentive. Reliable. And for a long time, that was the only story anyone ever told. Then, in 2017, she retired, just like that. No farewell interviews, no celebration of a career spent delivering thousands of babies. No announcement. No explanation. She left quietly. For 6 years, her name barely surfaced. Some assumed she had moved away. Others thought she was simply enjoying a well-earned rest after years of service. But in 2023, her name returned. And this time, it wasn't in whispered admiration. It was in coroner's reports, court documents, newspaper headlines, and the word beside it: murder. 18 women, 18 mothers, gone. Their stories buried under routine explanations. Their deaths marked as complications, as tragedies too common to question. Until one person did. A husband, devastated by loss but unwilling to let grief silence his questions. A retired detective who couldn't ignore a pattern that no one else had seen. A doctor who had warned authorities for years, only to be dismissed, over and over again. Together, they uncovered a secret that had been buried for more than a decade. A truth that changed everything. June 21, 2023, the day Sharon Denise Coleman was arrested. The woman once trusted to bring new life into the world was charged with taking it instead. And when police searched her home, what they found left them speechless. How did she do it? How did she go unnoticed for so long? And the question no one was ready to ask. How many more? Houston's Third Ward, a neighborhood rich with history, resilience, and culture. A place where families had roots that ran deep, where everyone knew someone, and where trust was often built over generations. It was a community that prided itself on looking out for one another. And for 12 years, from 2005 to 2017, there was one name mothers shared with confidence. Sharon Denise Coleman. She was more than a midwife. She was a figure of comfort, the one who answered calls in the middle of the night, who showed up when hospitals turned women away, who promised the safest, most natural experience for expectant mothers. But May 9, 2023, everything changed. A retired Houston detective, Marcus Bell, 58, sat in his kitchen, flipping through an old case file. He had worked hundreds of investigations, but this one. The death of his own cousin, Kimberly Sanders, had never sat right with him. She had been 34, healthy, glowing in her pregnancy, a woman who had no history of complications. And yet, she was gone. Her official cause of death: postpartum hemorrhage. A tragedy. A medical misfortune. Nothing criminal. That's what they had told him. For 6 years, he had tried to accept it. But now, he was staring at a list of names. 18 women. All black. All pregnant. All under the care of Sharon Denise Coleman. And all gone. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Dr. Patrice Warren, a respected OB/GYN, had been warning authorities for years. She had seen the same patterns: women brought into Houston Methodist Hospital, already slipping away, families telling stories that sounded too familiar. She said she didn't feel right, but the midwife told her to breathe through it. She was bleeding too much, but the midwife said it was normal. She lost consciousness, and by the time we got her here, she was gone. Dr. Warren had tried. She had filed complaints, sent letters, reported her concerns. But no one listened. Because Sharon Denise Coleman wasn't a doctor. She wasn't bound by the same regulations. And more importantly, she wasn't in the system. That was the reality of home births: no hospital oversight, no mandated reporting, no red flags in official records. And so, women kept dying. And their families kept grieving. Until one man refused to let it go. Terrence Johnson, 32, had lost his wife, Mariah Davis Johnson, in 2016. They had been together since high school, built a life together, dreamed of raising their child in the very neighborhood they had grown up in. Mariah had chosen Sharon Coleman because she didn't trust hospitals. She had heard the stories, of black mothers ignored in pain, of complications brushed aside, of mortality rates no one wanted to talk about. She wanted to feel safe. She wanted to be heard. And in the end, she never had a chance. Terrence had watched her slip away. He had begged Sharon Coleman to call 911 when Mariah started seizing. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed a wet cloth to Mariah's forehead and told him it was part of the process. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, by the time he threw her in the car and rushed her to the hospital, it was too late. Her official cause of death: amniotic fluid embolism. Another tragedy. Another statistic. But Terrence refused to accept it. For 7 years, he kept everything: Mariah's medical records, the texts between them and the midwife, the receipts, the timeline of her last hours. He spoke to other families. He found more cases, women who had died the same way, under the same care. And then, he found Marcus Bell, the retired detective who had buried his cousin, still waiting for an answer. Together, they laid it all out. 18 names. 18 deaths. And one woman at the center of it all. But no crime had been reported. Because no one had ever called it murder. Until now. Marcus Bell made the first call. Dr. Patrice Warren made the second. And soon, Houston's Homicide Division was reopening files that had been gathering dust for more than a decade. Then came the autopsies, re-examined, retested, and this time, the truth came out. Women who were healthy before labor, with no history of complications, had died from unusually high levels of synthetic oxytocin. A drug that induces labor. A drug that, in the wrong hands, can become lethal. A drug Sharon Denise Coleman was never supposed to have access to. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies painted a horrifying picture. And the moment they searched her home, everything collapsed. Medical supplies. Expired medications. Forged documents. And the most chilling discovery of all. A handwritten ledger. With every victim's name. Every date of death. And a symbol beside each one. The perfect crime. Until one mistake unraveled everything. The investigation gained momentum quickly. What started as a quiet re-examination of records became a full-scale inquiry, pulling in detectives, medical examiners, and forensic specialists. Every day, new evidence surfaced, and with each piece, the horrifying reality became harder to ignore. A 2023 audit of Houston's medical records revealed a pattern no one had noticed, or no one had wanted to see. 12 of the deaths had never been properly investigated. Some women's files were missing entirely from hospital records. Others had death certificates signed off without an autopsy, their causes of death listed as pregnancy-related complications, with no further explanation. The same hospitals that had dismissed Dr. Patrice Warren's concerns for years were now scrambling to account for how so many women had slipped through the cracks. And then came the whistleblower. A nurse from Houston Methodist, who had worked in the emergency department for over 15 years, stepped forward. She remembered seeing the same name, Sharon Coleman, over and over again in cases that ended the same way. She had treated at least 5 women who arrived after home births gone wrong. All of them had one thing in common. They were young, healthy, and they never woke up. The first time, she assumed it was a terrible accident. The second time, it felt like a tragic coincidence. The third time, she knew something was wrong. She told doctors. She filed reports. But nothing happened. By the time she saw her 5th patient from Sharon Coleman's care, a 26-year-old woman who had just given birth to her first child before falling into a coma, she had stopped believing anyone would listen. Now, they finally were. The breakthrough. An autopsy from 2016 was re-examined, one of the last cases before Sharon's quiet retirement. The original cause of death had been marked as sudden hemorrhaging due to childbirth. But this time, forensic pathologists tested for something that wasn't included in the first report. Pitocin. A drug used to induce labor and speed up contractions, a drug that, in high doses, can cause extreme bleeding, organ failure, and even death. The test results were undeniable. There were lethal amounts of Pitocin in her system, enough to kill her within minutes. And that's when detectives realized. Sharon Coleman hadn't just failed these women. She had drugged them. She had given them high doses of a medication that was never meant to be used outside of a hospital, without their knowledge, without their consent. And now, she was running out of places to hide. Conflicting testimonies. Investigators turned to those who had worked with Sharon Coleman, other midwives, assistants, women who had spent years in her orbit. Many had nothing but praise. She was always in control, one former apprentice said. She had this confidence about her. You never questioned her methods. But others remembered something else. She was secretive. Never let anyone watch her mix medications. She always had her own supplies. Never trusted what hospitals gave her. She told us that pain was just fear leaving the body. That women needed to suffer through it. It painted a disturbing picture. For years, Sharon Coleman had been the only authority in the room. No hospital staff. No oversight. No one to stop her. A survivor speaks. Keisha Monroe, 27, had barely survived. Her daughter had been born in 2015, in the back bedroom of her mother's house on Alameda Road. She had chosen Sharon Coleman because she trusted her experience. I kept telling her something was wrong, she recalled. I didn't feel right. I was shaking, my heart was racing. I felt like I was dying. Sharon didn't listen. She told me to hush. She said the body knows what to do. Then, Keisha collapsed. The last thing she remembered was her mother screaming, begging someone to call 911. She woke up 2 weeks later in the ICU. She had been in a coma, suffering from extreme blood loss and organ failure. Doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. And now, for the first time, she knew why. Because Sharon Coleman had done this to her. A community in denial. At first, some refused to believe it. Sharon had been a beloved figure in the community. A woman who had delivered hundreds of babies, whose name had been passed down through generations. There had to be another explanation. Maybe it was the hospitals, maybe they had ignored warning signs, dismissed symptoms, failed to act quickly enough. Maybe it was a bad batch of medication, something tainted, something that had gone unnoticed for too long. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't murder. But the evidence kept piling up. The Pitocin. The missing records. The forged prescriptions detectives found in her home. And then, police made a discovery that changed everything. A diary. Hidden in an attic, tucked away in a wooden chest. Inside, they found every woman's name. Every date. And next to each entry. A symbol. Some were marked with an X. Some had a circle around them. And one name, the very last entry. was crossed out so violently, the page was nearly torn in half. June 21, 2023. The day they arrested Sharon Denise Coleman. And the day the world finally saw who she really was. It was a discovery that would change everything. Tucked away in an attic, inside a locked wooden chest, hidden beneath old blankets and forgotten family relics, lay the diary. Detectives had been searching Sharon Coleman's daughter's home, a modest two-story house on the outskirts of Houston, when they found it. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, the edges worn from years of handling. It looked ordinary. Until they opened it. Inside, they found every name. 18 names. Each victim carefully recorded, their date of birth, their due dates, and, most disturbingly, their date of death. Beside every entry, a symbol. Some had a simple X drawn in heavy ink, pressing so deeply into the page that it left indentations on the sheets beneath it. Others had a circle, sketched neatly, as if she had been tracking something only she understood. And one, the very last entry, was different. The name had been scratched out so violently that the ink had bled through the paper, nearly tearing it apart. Investigators knew, instantly, that they had found something beyond evidence. They had found her confession. But it was one sentence at the bottom of the final page that would haunt them. They never should have trusted me. The words written in careful, deliberate strokes. The same steady hands that had once brought babies into the world had now documented the destruction she left behind. The case was no longer about negligence. It wasn't about medical malpractice. This was murder. The secret connection. As investigators pored over the diary, another pattern began to emerge. Several of the victims had been rejected by hospitals before turning to Sharon Coleman. Some had been denied care due to a lack of health insurance. Others had been dismissed after voicing concerns about pain, bleeding, or complications. To the outside world, Sharon had been their savior, the midwife who gave them an option when no one else would. But for some, she was something else entirely. Revenge. In several cases, detectives found that Sharon had a history with her victims. In 2008, one of the deceased women, Jasmine Carter, 29, had previously filed a complaint against her for unsafe practices. In 2011, another woman, Danielle Brooks, 32, had chosen a different midwife, rejecting Sharon's services after rumors of her questionable methods began circulating. Now, they were both dead. Both of their names appeared in the diary. Both marked with circles. And both cases had the same cause of death, postpartum complications. Coincidence? Or something much worse? On June 21, 2023, the police made their move. A team of uniformed officers and homicide detectives arrived at Sharon Coleman's modest home just before 5 a.m. The sun had barely begun to rise. Neighbors, roused by the flashing lights and the sound of officers knocking on her door, peeked through their curtains. Some stepped outside, phones in hand, recording what they never thought they would see. The woman who had been a pillar of the community, the trusted midwife, the grandmotherly figure, was now being led away in handcuffs. Her expression? Emotionless. No protests. No resistance. She didn't ask why they were there. She already knew. Inside her home, detectives found everything they needed to seal the case. Stolen medication bottles, labeled with hospital inventory tags. Fake medical credentials, printed on cheap, discolored paper, documents claiming she was still licensed to practice despite losing her certification over a decade earlier. They found binders filled with handwritten medical notes, some dating back to the early 2000s. But the most chilling discovery? A locked cabinet in her bedroom, where she had stored vials of Pitocin, syringes, and prescription drugs she was never authorized to possess. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Calculated. Intentional. And yet, when officers sat her down for questioning, she remained eerily calm. They expected denial. They expected anger. Instead, she met their eyes without blinking and simply said, "I helped them the way I saw fit." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission. It was a statement, as if, in her mind, what she had done was justified. What did she mean? What was her true motive? And the question that now loomed over the entire case. Was she really working alone? The courtroom was silent. Not with peace, but with a tension so thick, it clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. It was January 2024, the start of a trial that would shake Houston's Third Ward to its core. Sharon Denise Coleman sat at the defense table, her expression blank. The woman who had once been revered, trusted, even loved, now faced 18 counts of murder. The families filled the seats behind the prosecution. Mothers who had lost daughters. Children who had never met their mothers. Husbands who still woke up reaching for someone who was no longer there. The weight of every lost life bore down on the room. The trial begins. Prosecutors wasted no time painting the picture of a woman who had abused her power, who had betrayed the very people who trusted her most. They revealed the handwritten ledger, her diary, where she had recorded each name, each death, each chilling detail. They played 911 calls from frantic family members. "She's bleeding too much. She's not waking up." The midwife said everything was normal, but she's not breathing. And then, the video. A grainy CCTV clip, captured by a small pharmacy outside Houston. The timestamp read August 3, 2015, just weeks before one of her victims died. In the footage, Sharon Coleman could be seen purchasing large quantities of Pitocin, the drug found in the bodies of several victims. She paid in cash. No prescription. No questions asked. And when the clerk at the counter hesitated, questioning the purchase, she leaned forward, just enough for the camera to catch the sharp, unwavering certainty in her eyes, and said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." The families speak. One by one, they took the stand. Terrence Johnson, who lost his wife, Mariah Davis Johnson, in 2016, spoke first. He described the moment his world ended. How he had trusted Sharon. How he had believed she would bring his wife and child through safely. How she had watched as Mariah bled out in their bedroom, saying nothing, doing nothing, until it was too late. "I begged her to call for help," he said, his voice breaking. "She told me it was normal." He turned to face Sharon, his eyes locked on hers. "She let my wife die. And then, she walked away like nothing happened." Keisha Monroe, the woman who had survived, took the stand next. She was 27 now. She had spent 2 weeks in a coma after giving birth in 2015. She had woken up in a hospital bed, disoriented, confused, unable to hold her own child for the first time. "I was supposed to die too," she told the court. "I was supposed to be number 19. And then, her voice dropped to a whisper. "She didn't save us. She chose us." For weeks, the trial continued. Sharon Coleman never showed emotion. She never spoke in her defense. And when the jury returned on March 8, 2024, with a verdict that would change history, she never flinched. Guilty. 18 counts of first-degree murder. Multiple life sentences. No possibility of parole. As the judge read her fate, a sound rippled through the courtroom. Some sobbed, for justice, for relief, for pain that had no name. Others held their breath, listening for any reaction from Sharon Coleman. She simply stood. Her hands cuffed in front of her, her face empty. And before the guards led her away, she finally spoke. "You all wanted me to help them. So I did." A single sentence. And then, she was gone. The trial ended, but the questions never did. Why had no one stopped her sooner? How had so many women slipped through the cracks of the medical system? And the most haunting question of all. Were there more? Houston officials moved quickly, enacting strict new regulations on unlicensed midwives. Hospitals were now required to report suspicious maternal deaths, ensuring that no woman, no family, would be ignored again. But in Third Ward, the scars remained. For the families, justice had come too late. 18 women, gone. 18 futures, stolen. 18 lives, lost. And the world was left wondering. How many more are still waiting for justice? The case is closed. The verdict has been read. Sharon Denise Coleman will spend the rest of her life behind bars. But justice doesn't erase the pain left behind. 18 women. 18 families. 18 lives that should have been here today. And still, one question lingers. Did she really act alone? Was there someone else, helping her cover her tracks? Did the system fail these women long before they ever met Sharon Coleman? What do you think? Do you believe she had accomplices? Would you trust a midwife after hearing this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, real cases, real victims, real justice, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. If you believe justice was served, if you believe their voices should never be forgotten, click like on this video. Because their stories deserve to be told. And somewhere, someone is still waiting for justice.